What you are seeing here right now is one of the earliest films shot by Americans in the Philippines. Picturesque and evocative, this scene along the Pasig River in Manila in February 1900 takes us back to a bygone time when life was simpler and the Pasig River had not yet been tainted by overcrowding and pollution. But behind this lovely, seemingly innocent tidbit of reality captured in film lies a dark and violent story. A story that, some may argue, still continues to this day. A haunting legacy that all began when the Americans first decided to shoot paradise. Today we will be looking at some choice reels from the archives of the US Library of Congress. Lucky for us, they have made available to the public some of their digitized films through their YouTube channel. We will first be looking at how film technology was first developed and used in America, how it became a tool for colonization, and how the Americans perceived their brand new tropical colony at the turn of the 20th century. Film as a technology did not have one particular inventor. Rather, many inventors were working on capturing moving images towards the end of the 19th century. Film actually first came to the Philippines as early as 1897, when a Spaniard named Perchera showcased his French-made Gaumont chronophotograph in his salon in Escolta, Manila. However, despite this early innovation, Filipino film would not be influenced by the Spaniards as much as the Americans. In America, their champion film pioneer was no other than Thomas Alva Edison, whose company first made films available for public screening. These early films were usually no more than a minute long and depicted various scenes from real life. These actualities were usually shown before theatrical performances or vaudeville shows, as enticing novelties to drive people into theaters. So very early on, films were made for a mass audience and were marketed to appeal to whatever the audiences wanted to see during that time. By the end of the 1890s, with the advent of the Spanish-American War, the American audience wanted to witness the action too. No wonder then that Edison's company wanted to capitalize on this wartime fever. On May 25, 1898, they shot these troop ships sailing out of San Francisco to go to Manila. While it was not depicting the actual war, this reel still delighted the audiences and brought them patriotic pride to see their nation's troops heading out to defeat the dastardly Spanish and bring light to the dark islands. During that time, it was very difficult and downright dangerous to transport fragile and expensive film equipment across the ocean into a war zone. So many of the early films depicting the Spanish-American War either showed departing troops or were reconstructions of actual military campaigns on the islands. So even though this next film, shot in May 1899, is entitled Filipinos Retreat in the Trenches, and is supposed to depict the Battle of Candaba, the Edison Film Company actually shot these actualities in West Orange, New Jersey. The Filipinos were portrayed by African American members of the National Guard. Even though this was not as much reality as a reconstruction or representation of it, American audiences consumed this as if it were actual war footage. As Filipino film historian Nick de Ocampo notes, with the cries of imperialism ringing in the air, these films showed far-flung territories and gave a face to far-away enemies, thus drawing audiences to vaudeville houses to watch them. Films that depicted the defeat of America's enemies, in this instance, Filipino revolutionaries still defying US colonization, aroused patriotic responses from the predominantly white, male audiences. The medium of film has a sense of immediacy, of reality. It isn't reality, but it comes pretty close to it. Film makes tangible and visual people's preconceived notions of previously unseen things. Without having ever seen a Filipino before, American audiences during that time were able to equate Filipinos with dark-skinned savages, a trope that would continue to persist throughout the period of American colonization and would later fuel the hate Americans had of Filipinos as they migrated and made their homes in America. Take this film, for instance, entitled The Advance of Kansas Volunteers at Caloocan. The camera, looking out on the Filipinos from the American side, showed the Filipinos' futile attempts to shoot at the Americans. In fact, it is the Americans, both with their guns and with their cameras, shooting at the Filipinos, advancing upon their territory until they completely disappear from the screen. Because film has truth claims, in a way, it also makes discursively true the fantasies of the filmmaker. Because the violent savage has been eradicated on the screen, American audiences are led to believe that the Filipino insurrection has indeed been quelled. This finally brings us back to the first film we featured, this idyllic scene along the Pasig River. After finally pacifying Manila, it was safe enough for non-soldiers such as filmmakers to arrive in Manila. This one, shot by Raymond Ackerman for the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, is entitled Aguinaldo Snivy. Even though this wasn't really Aguinaldo Snivy, but more like the usual river traffic of Filipino civilians on a usual day, the way the film was framed showed the military insignificance of the Filipinos, especially of Aguinaldo, who seemed, for the Americans at least, to have surrendered all too easily. When compared with the earlier depiction of American military might, this film all the more justified America's conquest of the Philippines in order to bring the light of civilization to these paradise islands. Consumed avidly by American theatergoers, these films were the Marvel movies of their day, showing the American superheroes defeating the barbaric, savage, alien Filipinos. These heroes are still commemorated until today, in places such as Seattle's own Volunteer Park, which even has a plaque dedicating the park to the brave volunteers of the Spanish-American War. These films fueled the expansionist desires of America and helped shape public opinion favoring the occupation of the Philippines. Not long after the pacification of the lowlands of Luzon and Visayas, the Americans expanded to the highlands of northern Luzon and the previously unconquered island of Mindanao. As they expanded their sphere of influence, films continued to educate American filmgoers as well as further justify occupation. Soon, the violent imagery of early cinema gives way to a new kind of fantasy. The Pacific Islands, having been domesticated and pacified, cleared of the violent savage, replaces it with an image of the hospitable primitive. The South Seas genre is adapted to the Filipino context. These films retreated into an earlier era of first cultural contact and frequently presented this encounter with considerable romantic nostalgia, not unlike that of the Western film genre, rewriting a history that was in reality extremely violent in its subjection of the Pacific through the use of Western military advantages in weaponry and brutal domination of explorer and settler colonialism.
7,500 miles from the coast of California lies the group of 7,100 islands forming the Philippine archipelago under the protectorate of the United States government. And as part of this group is the island of Holo, also under the protectorate of the United States government, but the actual regional ruler is the Sultan of Sulu, head of the Mohammedan faith of the Sulu archipelago and Borneo. Although Holo is but 500 miles from Manila as the crow flies, it is 500 years and even more behind the march of time. The Chinese pier, built on the fever-infested mudflats, and the squalid, odious nipa shacks of the native Moro seemed hardly the background for romance. The Moro has refused the advances of civilization, and although living under the American flag spurns its protection, he is never without his deadly barong, boro, or kris, long, broad, razor-edged blades of Damascus steel, forged in their blacksmith shops, just as they were centuries ago. The man who keeps the home fires burning with the same bellows his ancestors used. And here's a keen fellow. He puts a fine edge on the whole business. See the point? The betel nut is the native chewing. This betel nut eater is answering the call to mess. And what a mess. the Great White Way of Holo. The marketplace. A native drove us in, and the smell of stale fish drove us out.
Film is never innocent or apolitical. Visualizing and making manifest the attitudes of their time, the camera can only capture things from the filmmaker's point of view. It is our responsibility to be mindful and reflective of the ways we consume film and find out more about the reasons why films were made at a specific time and place. If this presentation piqued your interest at all, I invite you to explore more of the Library of Congress's YouTube channel. Filipino-American filmmaker Marlon Fuentes also made a captivating mockumentary entitled Bontok Eulogy, using footage from the Library of Congress archive to explore the story of the Igorots who came to the St. Louis World's Fair. Some interesting books on the subject include Nick de Ocampo's Film American Influence on Philippine Cinema, Nerissa Bals's Body Parts of Empire, and Gina Apostol's novel Insurrecto. Thank you very much and keep watching films mindfully.